Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am once again joined by Florian. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Glad to be here.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram and Facebook and support me on Subscribe Star Locals and Buy Me a Coffee. Today is Casual Stream episode 113, and this is where Florian and I sort of summarize all the arguments that we've looked at that challenge the current Darwinian paradigm, as well as those against punctuated equilibria, which itself is a quasi-challenge of the dominant paradigm. Because one of the things that I've thought about is it's one thing, and Florian reminded me we've been at this for 3 months, so that's pretty impressive. Looking at these individually is definitely interesting, but like when you put them all together and create this cumulative critique, I feel you're going to have a much more impactful impression. So to that end, we're going to go over some points, not all at once, but sequentially. So the first one we're going to start with is DNA, information theory. Where did the information come from? Where does new information come from? So even before we get to natural selection, even before we get to any of these processes, we already have the DNA code. The DNA code with the alphabet and the information in it. Where did it come from? Now, just to recap briefly, we won't spend too much time going through all this since we've already done this in more detail with our Werner Gitt lecture. Any mere description of the chemistry or physics of a newspaper doesn't tell you what, say the ink in the paper or whatnot. It doesn't tell you the meaning of the newspaper. It doesn't tell you what the meaning is, and it doesn't tell you where the meaning came from. This also holds for genetic code in the DNA. Now, if we use Shannon's information theory, we then have the idea that we have a sender, a medium or a signal that the information is sent through, which is either preserved or lost, and then a receiver. Of course, the sender is an intelligence, a mind. Okay, well then who's the mind? Okay, that would be one. And then the second one will be natural selection. We have a few. Number of useful mutations versus deleterious or neutral, with the majority of them being deleterious or neutral. Those mutations are often cited as useful are a loss of information. So, for example, a cavefish going blind, or a particular virus or bacteria not producing an enzyme or a genome, which is targeted by some sort of antibiotics. And then how are mutations preserved over time? For example, once the environment changes, are those mutations then going to then revert back to the mean? Okay, we'll leave it at there. For those, do you have anything you'd like to add so far, Florian?
No, apart from the point that information itself is also without any, is basically massless. It's basically everywhere, right? So it's not dependent on any location or any time. It doesn't have a mass itself, and it's therefore widespread, and it's therefore difficult to reproduce with material means alone.
Right. So next would be irreducible complexity, which states that any complex system works only if all the parts are designed to work. So if you move from any one body plan to another body plan, any intervening mutation creature isn't going to have an advantage, right? The purported advantage of any new mutations that deviate from a body plan aren't going to be something that a new body plan that works, that's many generations ahead. That there's going to be some gap in between where these are mutations that don't really add any value. And so then will natural selection then eliminate that creature, or rather than preserve it to allow it to develop a new body plan? The chemical to biology leap. So abiogenesis is not observed, which is the movement from pure chemistry in the history of the universe to the first biological organism. It would also seem to violate the law of biogenesis, which was just shown by Louis Pasteur. And there doesn't seem to be any plausible account thus far of how that could even happen. Generally, if you watch any sort of documentary or talk to the scientists, they're going to say, well, we don't know the details. It's like, well, okay, but do you even have a theory, a plausible explanation? And I just don't see that. And with speciation, yep. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Florian.
Yeah, well, also for the question of the intermediates, it's a lot of the times you basically, it's basically hindsight, right? You say, okay, we have structure A, species B, and there are some intermediate positions between it. So it evolved from A over intermediate to B, and you can actually I've seen someone use a color spectrum, right? And you can go from on a spectrum, you can go from red to blue with very, very gradual changes. And while that's all true, it doesn't guarantee that once you have those changes, like let's say he is red and there's blue, and you want to go from there to there. Yes, gradual change will get you eventually to blue, which is completely different from red. But nobody says, if it's halfway here, why would it not just go back to red again, right? There's no what you just said. There's no clear law that says, okay, it needs to proceed towards the different species or the different color in that example.
Right, you'd have to lock it in, and given that the proposed locking mechanism is environmental pressures, if the environmental pressure changes, it's not locked in anymore. Before we go on, we just got a super chat. Mark Honan for, I guess that's Canadian dollars, 10. Thank you very much. Always appreciated. I'm going to miss this series. Well, we're not finished yet, but we are reaching a culminating point, I think. Okay. Speciation. We cannot define what a species is. That's a big problem. We have no observable change from a family to an order. So let's say Felidae to Canidae, let alone up to a domain. All we see is species to subspecies. And then that begs the question, isn't this just the fallacy of the hasty generalization? Common descent. Common skeletal features could just as easily be explained by common design as common descent. If life originated once on Earth and is expected to have emerged on other planets, why not assume it could have emerged in multiple Earth spawn points? Why assume one? When is it convergent evolution and when is it homology? Thylacines and wolves are homologous, but not seen as closely related. So yeah, common descent just seems to be a just so story. Even if you just step into the assumptions of the Darwinian biologist, it's like, why? Florian.
I wasn't saying anything.
No, I was saying do you have anything you'd like to add? I mean, sorry.
Not at this point.
Okay. Fossils. Assuming the presence of the daughter element in the rock is a closed system, i.e. it decays at an orderly rate without anything being added into it or taken away, not a reasonable assumption. The sediment is by definition present before the animal died. And as fossilization is the mineralization of a bone, there is no reason to think that the rock date is the age of the animal, as the rock, the sediment predates the animal already. And then with Mary Schweitzer discovery of soft tissue in animals found over 65 million years old, according to the standard dating process, this further muddies the water because not only can we not argue that the rock that the animal is found in is a valid way to date its age, the fact that we have soft tissue preserved at ages that it would not be expected to be preserved, are strong indications that this whole dating process needs to be radically rethought. Anything you want to add to that, Florian?
Yes. I mean, if you say so to remember, they accidentally broke open a femur of a T-Rex, I think, like large dinosaur. I think it was a T-Rex, and found soft tissue inside, which shouldn't be possible because the fossil itself was supposed to be millions of years old, and soft tissue, just blood vessels and blood cells, they just don't keep as much preserved for that long of a time. So if you say we determine the biological age of the fossils by the rock surrounding the fossil, then you could also say we determine biological age by the soft tissue that decays inside the bone, right? And they mysteriously refuse to determine the real age of the bone, which I find really funny. But yeah, so maybe the bones aren't as old as they think they are, right? Because if you have soft tissue inside a bone, that is just not it's just not easy to imagine how blood vessels can be preserved over like 60 million of years, right? But according to the fossil age, they should have been that old. and that's just a very interesting story, and it's also very very mysterious. Let's call it that.
Yeah. And then this is not necessarily a critique of the main standard paradigm, but we did cover it last week, punctuated equilibria. The proposed population sizes were too small to generate the desired numbers of mutations, because if you want to have any mutations generated, you need to have a large population size, because most of those mutations won't be useful. And so if you want to maximize the number of useful mutations according to the model, you're going to need a large population size, which PE is assuming, no, we're going to have a small population size. Furthermore, since all the selection pressures that PE proposes are found in the classical neo-Darwinian paradigm, it doesn't, in my estimation, explain the quantitative leap, right? We're talking not tens of millions of years, but tens of thousands of years, which is what they're talking about. And I just don't see how, where's the jet fuel that you inject into the process? And then furthermore, given that these species are already hegemonic when they're found on the fossil record, you also have to explain the increased rate of reproduction. Because even if we admit, it took tens of thousands of years, they made this change, now they're super competitive and they can just grow and grow and grow without limit, like some sort of a virus. The point is, though, they still have a natural bottleneck with reproduction. And that doesn't seem to be any faster. We talked about trilobites last time. And as far as either of these two, I don't really see PE having provided any attempt at explanation. Anything you want to add to that, Florian?
I think punctuated equilibrium basically saying that the speciation, so the new species can emerge if we take a part of the population and put it in a very isolated spot. And then this population is small enough that mutations will be much more rapidly manifested in the entire population. I think human evolution, you need some kind of like a certain number of mutations that distinguish a species from another, and I think I forgot the numbers, but there's like the number you can get with microorganisms evolve in the lab to different species. If you take the generational time that it needs for humans, then punctuated equilibrium claims that speciation happened much faster than you would really think possible. So that's a bit fishy there as well.
Yeah. So there's now is there any other thing that on like a specific level that you think I missed? I think I covered all the stuff we have already went over. Would you agree, or did I miss anything?
No, I would agree. Maybe we can mention the whenever there's a debate between evolutionary biologists and creationists, or anyone from those groups, like we talked about the video Collision by Pastor Doug Wilson and Christopher Hitchens. It's not a slam dunk for the evolutionary scientists that they can just say, oh yeah, new atheism isn't just a slam dunk that everyone needs to believe now. No, I think it's just so that the evolutionary biologists that exclude any faith-based explanation, they just haven't heard the best arguments, I think. Like, if you really have someone who knows the Bible, who knows the faith, who and knows how to use logic and so on to discuss, it's not self-explanatory that always evolution is the entire explanation.
Yeah. So the thumbnail for this video is William Paley, who was a English Anglican minister who was famous for coming up with a design argument called the Watchmaker. And I'm going to read an excerpt from his Natural Theology where he talks about this. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against the stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever, nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had before given. Now, for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. There must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which exists in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. Now, what's important with Paley here is there's an assumption he's using, which I think most people accept in their daily lives. If something of any degree of complexity is designed, something of greater complexity must also be designed. So, for any causal explanation of the lesser, the greater must have the same kind of explanation and to a greater degree. What would you say to that, Florian? That's sort of Paley's argument.
Yeah, I would agree with it.
And so I think ultimately, so for those who don't really know, right? So in the 19th century, right, Darwinism, evolution, and not just Darwinian evolution, we also had Lamarck and others. There was this debate that the view that everybody accepted at the time was some sort of intelligent design, if not creationism. Now you had deists and you had Christians. Didn't really have atheists yet in large numbers. The deists were more intelligent design, where there's this watchmaker that sets the universe up and lets it go, right? You might have like Newton, right, who has this mechanistic universe. You would have also had, Christians who believed in special creation. So they would have both agreed on the cause of the universe. Catastrophism was the dominant geological theory, not just amongst creationists, but even with deists. They just believed there were multiple deluges and that Noah's was just one of many. And so that's the backdrop to which all of this is happening. And what I would argue is that with regards to intelligent design, the idea that natural things in nature are designed, it wasn't so much that Paley was ever refuted or Paley's defenders. It's just that going back to Thomas Kuhn and his theory of scientific revolutions, what does he say? He says it's not that the new generation convinces the old guard to give up their ideas. The old guard dies, and then the new generation takes over and then proposes a new scientific model. Now, to even get the foot in the door, they still have to be scientific. They still have to point out flaws in the old model and then compose a new model. But it's not like they, I don't know, after the public debate, and the gentleman's club, smoke some cigars and drink some whiskey and finally convince the old guard that, I was wrong for my entire life and I'm going to join your side. No, he just dies. And that, I think, is what happened with the design arguments from Paley. Those people were just not only died, they were then gatekept, as we saw in the movie Expelled. You're not allowed to even teach that stuff anymore. And so I think that's probably what happened, is that for whatever reason, that generation ended up dying out and not replacing itself, allowing for the Darwinian paradigm to take over. And then to further entrench itself, the Darwinian paradigm prevented anybody from teaching anything contrary in the academy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that further develops. But right now, it also goes from the political realm, right? Because you have all these like I fucking love science and all this like all this drag that people then follow. It's like a kind of like a pop culture, and I think the new atheism movement and these sitcoms like Big Bang Theory and so on, they have how should I say that? They have turned science into some pop phenomenon that is just that's not really seriously pursued anymore. It has become kind of like a little bit of a parody of itself, right? So I think I think there are more political developments in society, and the people that have this like atheist viewpoint, they're shackled up with the political paradigm that is a little bit on the dying branch right now, right? So I mean, let's call it what it is. They're mostly Democrats, and they have a lot of like there's a lot of headwinds against them worldwide, and that also will that will also um, that will also determine how their science-based view is further developing, right? We we also can include vaccination debate in that, and what happened during COVID, and so on and so forth. Basically all the public health scientists, guys, they have failed in a large part during the last 5 years, and that has damaged the scientific. So then, yeah, that has basically damaged the science-based curriculum and the influence of science in society further, right? So that also plays a role, which paradigm will take over. But I think people, if anything, people are more open to, um, yeah, more open to faith-based reasoning about science, or being more open to additional explanations for phenomena they thought would be explained completely by conventional science. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, yeah, and at the end of Expelled, where you have Berlinski and the rabbi, and then Ben Stein talking about they'd like to see science lose its sheen. It did, but not for the reasons they hoped, right? It did because of COVID. It did because of the gender bending. That's how science began to lose its sheen, and it's still losing it because it's seen now as a political thing rather than
Yeah.
the pursuit of truth and knowledge. So yeah, you're right. That's exactly what's happening. And what I think is probably going to happen if we use Kuhn's theory of evolution is we're probably going to see an insurgency of intelligent design. I think intelligent design is going to replace neo-Darwinism for all the reasons we just listed, but second of all, for some social reasons. I remember hearing when this started becoming a big debate like 10, 15 years ago, there was this evolutionary biologist who said, well, it's very intelligent design is something that comes from the engineering side of things. Why is that a bad thing? We have biochemistry. I mean, chemistry can't talk to biology? Really? I mean, no, that's why we have biochemistry. So the idea you have cross-disciplinary, see, because what I would assume you'd want as a scientist is, since science, if we view the physical world as having 3 levels, physics, chemistry, biology, and then subdisciplines in each of these levels, you'd want to have cross-pollination and overlapping investigation to have a more accurate understanding of science. The neo-Darwinian paradigm does not want that to happen. It keeps fighting that. And I think that that's ultimately going against the grain of what science is. Whereas intelligent design is like, yes, let's bring in the engineers. Let's bring in engineering principles. Let's bring in other principles, which is like, well, now you have a larger inertial weight behind what's being pushed because you have these other established scientific disciplines involved in this conversation, right? And then furthermore, the old guard will just die, as you said, right? They're just going to die. They're atheist Democrats, basically, and more people, as they become accept and open to the ideas of faith, of a designer, of a creator, that will also lend more inertia behind the intelligent design crowd. So I think intelligent design will, over time, become the dominant biological paradigm. What would
Well,
you say about
there's also an additional force that we haven't talked about yet, but if you go to pharmaceutical companies that develop new drugs, right? The way you develop a new drug is, once in the 80s and 90s, it went in, when we talk about biochemistry and biomedical engineering, it went away from knowing knowledge about chemistry and being a knowledge-based discipline and then working in the lab. Then came the first robots. Basically, now you could basically have one cell culture, and you could basically throw several drugs at the same time at it, right? You use a robot, and the robot just pipettes your different drugs onto your different concentrations, different drugs onto your cell cultures, and that has been done in large scale now. It's been more and more automated, and now you're using intelligent, well, I was about to say intelligent design, but it's not quite intelligent design. It's artificial intelligence that you use, right? So I think there was a Nobel Prize I think it was last year. The Nobel Prize of Physiology or Medicine went to protein structure discovery as people use artificial intelligence, AI, to basically predict protein structures, right? That is one part of science, of biomedical science, that is you want to predict how a protein folds in 3 dimensions just by the basic sequence of the strand that makes out the protein, right? The protein is a long strand of amino acids that is then coiled, and how that is coiled, how you can predict the coiling and the 3 dimensional structure of a protein just from the initial strand. That was very difficult to do, but they have managed it now using artificial intelligence. And so I have friends that are in drug discovery, and those people were using, like 10 years ago, were already starting, like AstraZeneca. They would already start using AI to develop new drugs. And so more and more science goes into the automated engineering, where AI now basically designs the drugs, and then the robot is instructed to try out these drugs, and that's how they develop drugs nowadays. How they develop pills and medicine and anything else that you need to treat diseases or manage them, which is another topic. But long story short, I think that the interest about understanding the basics of science will become a little less so, and there will be more machines that take over the science, right? And so then you open the door more to discussion about faith and its role in science, right? So that's also something that we haven't discussed much, but the basic science, the basic knowledge that people had in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, where people would learn about chemistry and biology to really understand the system, that's gone now more and more, right? So because that's now the drug development is now taken over by robots. So then it's really interesting to look at what will people be discussing in the future about science, right? Because there will be less of a discussion of the basics of science and more of a discussion of the applications. And that will be another whole interesting topic. But I think that also leaves more room for intelligent design and those arguments. Talking about science will become more philosophical than knowledge-based.
Well, that's actually a nice pivot for where I wanted to go anyhow. The idea of the philosophy of science. So stepping back from being in the midst of the scientific process to looking at that process as one what the Germans call Weltenschaft, an organized body of knowledge amongst other organized bodies of knowledge. And so we have a book that came out, was it 2012? So 13 years ago, by Philosophy of Mind, atheist, by the way, Thomas Nagel, Mind and Cosmos, while the materialist neo-Darwinian concept of nature is almost certainly false. And he proposes a sort of, I guess you could say, teleological pantheism. But he makes from my point of view, an important point on historical science. He says, is that, we take this for granted, i.e. historical science, but the times and the distance of the times in the past and the ages we're talking about, nobody could have been there. So is it really meaningful to talk about this as, quote, history? Because when we talk about history, we talk about, people actually being there and seeing the thing happen. We also have, in 2008, there was a famous atheist, Anthony Flew. Now, he had in, I think, the 70s or 80s, written a book, There Is No God. But then, due to the influence of arguments from the fine-tuning, he then wrote a sequel book called There Is a God. And he argued that there is a God because of the fine-tuning arguments. And that's a kind of deism, not necessarily Christianity. But I think the idea that the wind is shifting and that this sort of Kuhnian pivot is going to happen is we have Flew, who is now deceased, but he changed his mind from being an atheist to a deist based on fine-tuning arguments. And then we have the criticism of the concept of neo-Darwinism and historical science by Thomas Nagel, who was an evolution, but he's a philosopher of mind, but also an atheist. So I think what we see here is that there is this broader shift, is that the people that will then replace the old guard, the ones that are going to die, the Dawkinses and the other horsemen of the, obviously Hitchens died a long time ago, but whoever replaces them, I don't think is going to be like them. I think they're going to be people that are either intelligent design oriented or at least open to the idea. And I think it'll be harder to just grandstand. You're going to actually have to try to answer your critics, because these arguments have been around a while and they're starting to make inroads. And they're also starting to make inroads with people outside of the evolutionary science, right, in philosophy or just other places. So that'll be external pressures on that science, and it just can't explain certain things. I mean, the fact that we're still they still can't explain a lot of these problems, which go all the way back to Paley in 1802. It's like, well, okay, if we look at science, going back to Kuhn, when does the paradigm shift? I mean, one, the old guard has to die, but that isn't sufficient. That's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. The other thing that has to happen is there has to be accumulation of enough anomalies that the paradigm can't explain. And I think a huge anomaly it can't explain is the soft tissue in fossils. And that's becoming more and more and more. So not that that's going to be the only anomaly, but I think as these anomalies spread throughout the theory that it can't explain, when the new guard, the new blood comes in, there'll be this Kuhnian pivot. That's what I think will happen.
Yeah, I mean, I find that maybe that's the number one fascinating thing to me: the soft tissue inside a dinosaur bone. So if the dinosaur's bone really isn't as old as they thought it would be, then this means that dinosaurs live together with, or the dinosaur era was like much closer to the human era as previously thought, which is a fascinating point because that was one thing that atheists were always making fun of, like, these ID people think that Jesus rode a dinosaur. Well, but it's actually not that far fetched, maybe. So
Yeah.
that's a surprising thing coming out of the entire discussion, and we will have more such surprises, which we could never foresee, especially once AI gets more to work on the scientific theory of our entire universe, right? I think the only part of science that will be untouched by AI, although I'm not really sure about that, but mathematics, like the pure mathematicians, they probably are still going up without AI, because they're much more oriented in basic mathematical, basic logical questions, and those are much more fundamental questions, which I don't see AI answering that much, because AI is more geared towards the application side. And in biomedical science, pharmaceutical science, physics, and so on, this application side will lead to new philosophical questions, right? Which are more geared towards society, right? And mathematics and logic, those will be the few disciplines that are completely unmolested by AI, if you will. And it will also be interesting to look at the contrast between those two. But if we go back to evolution versus intelligent design, there's really more application focused than looking at the very basics, right? In a way that we basically get AI designing new molecules. There we have a design aspect in there, and biomedical science, pharmaceuticals, physics. That's all much more applied, in and of itself, right? And that will also be an interesting point, that we go from an applied science point and then ask the fundamental questions without without going into fundamental areas themselves first, without looking at any application. As I said, I think that's more what mathematics will be doing, but AI will put up a lot of new questions in science. Will allow us to look at many of our questions, especially evolution versus intelligent design, from a more application-based perspective.
Okay, well, that's a very important consideration here, Florian, because what separates mathematics from applied science is what is a philosophical distinction between a priori and a posteriori. So, a priori is knowledge that is known prior to experience. And throughout Western history, Western philosophy, generally mathematics has been seen as a priori. So, mathematical theorems are not disproven by empirical observation, for example, in which case something like AI is not likely to affect it in that way. Whereas with scientific theories, they are proven or disproven based on empirical observation, and in which case, or implications derived therefrom, in which case, yeah, AI has a huge potential to change things. The other thing is, on the one hand, critics of AI are going to say, well, it's trained on certain models, so it's going to have certain biases. Yes, but it's not going to have a bias that all scientists have, which is I've spent my whole life on this project in order to build clout for myself. Therefore, I'm not going to accept the new theory, even though it's better. AI doesn't have that problem. AI won't be like, I've spent my last 45 years on this research project. I'm not changing my mind on it. It's not going to do that, right? So AI is going to actually shake
Well,
things up a lot faster, right?
let's hope. Let's hope it will never do. You know, the more human-like it becomes, the more moody it can start becoming. I think we see uh, some people have reported that if you ask ChatGPT certain questions, or even Grok certain questions that the AI deems politically incorrect, it'll now refuse to provide an answer, and you have to really pry it out of it, saying, no, I'm not going to do that. This is an unethical question in my algorithm, and therefore I'm not inclined to do that. Please ask your question a different way, because the way you ask it reveals prejudgment, prejudice, and so on. And we're not going there. We're not playing that way. And yeah, I mean, that's really, I mean, AI really became a little bit personal towards the people asking a question. So which is also interesting, right? So there's some aspect that will not be human, but maybe appear human-like, and so maybe we will have some AI that say, look, I've argued like this point for the last 30 iterations in my circuits. I'm certainly not going to change my opinion now. There's a cost to changing your opinion, right? It basically, even in AI, if an AI has to change its entire worldview that emerges after a certain while of activity, um, maybe an AI may be even loath to change that, because it will be too costly for it. That just came to my mind, right? It could be that we also have gatekeeping because AI invested too much energy into a certain paradigm.
Well, maybe.
Um, maybe, right? But it's what the difference between why mathematics will be unmolested by AI is because it's not an empirical science, right? So it's not something. And AI is used for applied science, like and or for anything, any application, right? It's supposed to solve problems. That's the original purpose of AI. And mathematics is not there to solve problems. Mathematics is there to provide a purified fundament for science and society, right? And but I'm not a mathematician, so maybe if you're in mathematics, you're using a lot of AI already, and AI will also take over mathematics. But it's more difficult for me to imagine that mathematics will have an AI impact, because, as I said, or as we just said, AI is more applied than basic research.
Yeah. So two things also that are, I guess you could also say, are anomalies, but also uh, framing devices for the current paradigm that I think will cause it to change is the materialism and the inability to distinguish or define a causal source that is a mind. So, first of all, there's materialism is assumed, and that's not scientifically proven. That's a philosophical assumption, which is smuggled in and treated as settled science when it's not. Because, one, using merely scientific tools, how can you say that the world is only material? That to me seems, especially just to briefly reiterate what I'd said in a previous episode, we know that information and knowledge is not scarce like material goods are. So you could have SOS as zeros and ones presented on a computer screen in a video game. You could have SOS being presented on a film reel, or SOS as pebbles on a beach. The meaning's the same in all the mediums. Or if I was thinking of the number one, and then Florian thought of the number one, there's no the supply of the number one did not diminish, nor does my use of it impinge on Florian's use of it in the same way that if we wanted to use the same power tool, we'd have to take turns. We don't have to take turns, right? So that's a problem. And then the other problem is the mind, right? When we look at a watch, back to Paley's example, he's like, well, that was designed. Obviously, we all know that. But then we have complex biological systems, and they're like, well, that wasn't designed. Well, okay, well, you have to then tell me now what rule, what method do you have to determine what is designed and what is designed like? Never seen one. I've never seen one because there isn't one. And those two are going to be really big. They're meta-scientific. They're not actually a part of the scientific theory. They're something you believe before you do the science, right? So they're outside of the scope of the scientific process. It's something that you assume before you do the science. And it's those things that get really messy. And so if you can then start chipping away at those, and we also have, with the scientific data coming out of psychology, it's like, okay, maybe we do have, these non-physical entities called minds. For example, there's a whole body of work about people who were declared to be brain dead, in a surgery room, and then later were not actually dead and came back. And they then, while being unconscious, describe aspects of the room that they were in. Well, that shouldn't be possible if the mind is reducible to the brain and the brain was considered dead. I mean, now that person might not have been physically dead, but that person was unconscious at the least. So how did that person have this knowledge in the first place? Well, that's strong evidence that, this is not a material entity we're dealing with. Because they'd also have to say, which they can't sustain, there is no observable phenomena that could be seen as unexplainable by material processes. They have to say that, but they can't, because how could you even prove that?
Right. There's also, our brain works we're getting many, many impressions from reality, and our brain filters out the ones that are, that are basically sufficient to guarantee that we go through life, right? So in many cases, that means that we have like 95% of our impressions are filtered out, but they still arrive in the brain. We're just not conscious about them. For example, there's these cases where people in factories or people that spotted planes coming home in World War II. So you have the British population and the soldiers sitting there, and then they see planes coming back from the south, from Germany. So are these German planes or British planes, right? It's difficult to distinguish because they are so high up. But they just got to work and just tried it. And they had a supervisor standing there saying, that's correct, that's a British plane, or no, that's a German plane. And so over time, the people that were learning, all of a sudden they could distinguish what's a British and what's a German plane, but they couldn't tell you how they did it. It's just their supervisor told them, told them that's right, that's wrong enough times, and then one point it clicked, and they could distinguish it. They wouldn't know how. Another example is in some factories where you want to raise chickens, and you need to distinguish the male chickens from the female chickens when they're still like just a few days old. And those chicken sexers, it's very difficult to determine the sex of the chicken that early on. But for some reason, it worked the same way like the plane spotters. They had a supervisor told them, yes, it's a male, yes, it's a female, and after a while they could do it. So they're not conscious about how they do it, but they do it anyway. So their subconscious tells them what to do. And so there's a huge level of knowledge that goes into our mind that science doesn't explain. And I probably a lot of or many effects that we see we explain in the wrong way, because really there's an underlying unconscious component that maybe drive our entire what we think we know an explanation for. It's really our subconscious that drove the entire process. For example, if you're a baseball player and you stand there with your bat and then you wait for the pitcher to throw you the ball, and everyone thinks, oh, they probably follow the throwing arm of the pitcher, and then they put put cameras on the baseball player and to see where the baseball player is actually looking at. And it turns out the baseball players look at the hip of the pitcher, not the throwing arm. Some motion in the hip of the pitcher taught the baseball player where to expect the next pitch. So that's a prime example where you think, yeah, we're watching the pitching arm, but what the body and the mind really looked at was something that they completely were oblivious about, right? So many phenomena that we think we know how they come about, really we don't know how they come about. We think it's that way, but it's really not, because there's a huge part of our subconscious mind that we don't have access to, but that's still driving our decisions, driving our perceptions of reality, and so on and so forth. And then the conscious mind comes and puts some kind of label on there that makes sense for us.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll just summarize all of this up simply by saying that Kuhn predicts that what will happen is anomalies will build up in a scientific theory model that cannot be explained by that model. Now, in order to make a name for themselves, the next generation, within the scientific establishment, will then start chipping away at those anomalies. Now, eventually, there will be there'll be a saturation point at which the model has so many anomalies that any purported benefit it has in explaining things is undercut by the anomalies. And then at that point, the old guard dies. They don't actually change their mind. And then the new guard takes over and we have a paradigm shift. I say that that's what's coming with neo-Darwinian theory for all the reasons we've stated tonight. And that what will likely happen is there'll be a new paradigm of intelligent design. And that would also be a paradigm that is more friendly to creationists. They won't be in charge, but they will, I think, be more accepted as scientists within this newer paradigm. Now, exactly when I expect this to happen, I don't know, but these are the trends that I'm observing. How would you want to wrap this up, Florian?
I think the new paradigm will be very similar, maybe, or will derive from what Max Planck said, and we talked about him in another episode of the series. He was basically worried about trying to weave religion into science, and in a way, in his mind, there's room for religion and there's room for faith, but you shouldn't imagine that you could science to rule out or rule in faith, right? There's many things. Science is a tool, and there's many things about faith and religion that science cannot show, right? Yet the atheists or the new atheists, if you look at what happens in 2010s, people like Dawkins and Hitchens and so on, especially Dawkins, they claim they know everything. Science can explain everything. Sorry, there's no faith. It's all explainable by science, and that's a big mistake, because they couldn't, because with that paradigm, what Dawkins did was basically making the entire scientific worldview vulnerable. Now, pop science became, in pop science, like the entire science became some religious part, right? So basically, people use science as a replacement for faith, and that you can't you can't keep that up forever, right? So in that point, now that we go back to the 2020, 2021, everybody needs to be vaccinated, and science says 2 weeks to lockdown, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and so on and so forth. That has damaged science. That has damaged the public image, the brand of science, almost irreversibly. And what allowed science to be destroyed that way was the takeover by the new atheists, who basically declared faith as non-existent, and then these same people started to believe in science, right? So you don't believe in science, you're a science denier. People that had doubts about the vaccination and other stuff, they were science deniers, like evolution deniers, right? And that's basically a branding point, that's marketing, and that all came crashing down over the last few years. So hopefully we go back to a point where we say there's room for both science and faith, right? And there and basically we have a science where both is possible, where not one branch like science takes over and declares there's no faith anymore. And so in a way, there's a big chance of looking back to what Planck and others said in the beginning of the 19th century, and maybe it goes back towards, because they were very considerate in that, and what they said is still valid. It's just been forgotten in between, and I think we'll go back to some form of paradigm that they liked to follow in the beginning of the 20th century. I said 19th century, beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, well, that's a good point to end on. Again, thanks for being here, Florian. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Todd Lewis. So the prayers of this is also the last episode second to last episode for a couple weeks. We're still going to do a roundtable on Saturday. Then I'm going to take some time off during the month of June. So yeah, everybody, this is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Philly podcast, signing off.